I've been brewing for probably about 10 years or so. Mead, I started it probably about 5 years ago, and I got into cider about 3 years ago as well. But I was laureled and pelicaned same day in 2017. Got my laurel in tablet weaving and brewing. And I was knighted 11 and a half months after that. Just going to do a quick and dirty mead making. I only do the minimum required for making mead because it's so simple to make it. Simple ingredients: honey, water, yeast. Because of honey being antimicrobial, I actually do not heat up anything when I make mead. Just because then it also is quicker, so you don't have to wait for it to cool down. Because usually when I'm brewing beer, I'm running it through some type of cooling coils to get it quicker so I can pitch the yeast. Certain types of yeast that I tend to use, EA11. So I tend to use this one for the vanilla or other type of fruit one that's not a red berry type of the flavoring. Just because, I always use dry wine yeast. The reason for the dry wine yeast is because they're easy to store, they're easy to pitch, and then also if you want to under pitch or over pitch, you don't have to actually have a chemistry set up to determine how many cells of yeast. Because in one packet of dry yeast is several billion yeast cells. So if you want to over pitch, you can add more, and you can measure it by gram. Every single gram is going to have an equal distribution of number of yeast cells. So it makes it a lot easier for that. Whereas liquid yeast is, okay, you have this vial that has like a billion yeast cells. But if you take half of that vial, you're not guaranteed to get half of the yeast cells. It's much harder to overpitch or underpitch a liquid yeast. And you might want to do that for certain cases, for if you wanted to, if it's more high ABV, to finish off quicker, or to not have a certain type of esters or essentially flavor profiles that you want to restrict, or if you wanted to underpitch, you want it to overwork, so it's going to produce a different type of flavor as well. So I always use dry yeast. And then difference between honey and beer is the nutrients available in the honey, what the yeast needs is not all there. So that's why I usually use a yeast energizer and yeast nutrient. I have one package, that's the Fermentation K. This is a baggie that I mixed together of the Go Firm Protect and the Fermentation K already to get a little bit ahead of things, because doing rehydrating yeast takes a little bit longer than the half an hour I had. So I already started to rehydrate this yeast. So I ended up taking about 4 ounces of water at about 104 degrees, and then added a tablespoon of honey, and then a 1/4 teaspoon of the yeast, the energizer and yeast nutrient, and then just kind of let it sit for an hour or two, cover it up, put it into some type of measuring cup, put some type of plastic over it. So that's pretty much what I do with yeast and the yeast energizer. And so basic steps: sanitizing the bucket or whatever you're fermenting in. I tend to use PBW for the actual cleansing of the containers. So this is just usually a scoopful per gallon, added to the warm water, let it sit for about a half an hour. It's kind of similar to OxyClean. And then for sanitizing, I use Star San. It is the acid-based yeast, so it's a contact of the sanitizer. So I set up one thing of sanitizer that lasts me for about a month or two into a weed sprayer. So you mix that up into there, put pressure in there, and then you actually get spraying contact in your the surface. And so you can actually just spray the top portion of a bucket, and it will actually run down, so you actually use less of the sanitizer. And I'll start off with the rehydrating yeast, then go into the sanitizing. And at that point, while it's actually rehydrating, that's when I'll be prepping all my other ingredients. I tend to buy my honey in 5-gallon buckets from farms across the country. This last patch that I purchased, because it was the cheapest I found, which was like $180 for a 5-gallon bucket, and free FedEx shipping, was a farm out of Texas. So it was Texas wildflower honey. There's actually, I found after I got this, I found that there's actually a cheaper method that you can do, which is if you have a Costco membership, they sell 5-pound bottles of their wildflower honey. It's like $11.50 per 5 pounds. So you can actually do a 5-gallon batch, 15 pounds for like $35-40. So measuring out the honey, if it's actually if it's crystallized, if it's been around, you just need to heat it up. So either make a hot water bath to kind of heat up the container while stirring it, or if you live in Arizona and it's the summer, just put it in your car for like an hour or two. But that's just to get it all heated up and mixed in. And so for a 5-gallon batch of honey, I usually do, for a sweet mead, I usually do about 15 pounds, which is about 1.25 gallons. You can go down to about 12 pounds for more of a drier one, or if you want to back sweeten after fact. I don't like back sweeten bottles just because it has a chance of restarting the yeast and exploding bottles if it's not done right, or if you bottle it too early. So I tend to use about 15 pounds of honey for 5-gallon batch. So I'm just going to be doing the traditional mead right now. So just honey, water, yeast. Might add like secondary in about a month or so. I might actually add some other fruit flavors because I was planning on doing some type of like orange ginger mead in the near future. Also for time and effort of actually seeing video of me measuring things, I already filled in 15 pounds of honey into my bucket. So all I have to do is add 3 3/4 gallons of water. And then once do that is pitching the yeast. Once actually the yeast is pitched and fermentation starts, so like within probably, if you pitch it towards the middle of the day, fermentation, they'll probably start sometime the next day. 24 hours after fermentation starts, I take the yeast nutrient yeast energizer and I mix a little bit more water, a little bit more honey, another 1/4 teaspoon, mix that in there and add it to the fermenting bucket. That will kickstart the yeast again. And then on 24 hours after that, I do it again. And then about 6 weeks after that, I put in the 4th and final of the yeast nutrient and energizer regimen. The reason for the yeast nutrient and energizer regimen is the yeast needs nitrogen. It needs some type of essentially a nitrogen component to kind of be able to work properly. Otherwise, it's kind of going to be overworked, which was like if you don't use yeast nutrient energizer, it's still going to work. It's just going to take more time. That's why usually it's like, okay, I'm going to let this sit for like 2 years and then bottle just to be sure. But this is kind of more an acceleration just because you're giving all the actual food and energy it needs to thrive and make its alcohol.
I have a quick question on the accelerant nutrient energizer. I'm hearing 24 hours and then 24 hours.
Yeah, so the 24 hours after fermentation, 48 hours after fermentation, and then about 6-8 weeks after fermentation.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So that, I do that. I mean, you can do it in other ways. You can add all of one into it at the beginning, and then you can split up the other one kind of as a beginning and an end. I just tend to like to do equal throughout the actual fermentation process, and pretty much that regimen, at least in my experience, has been the best results.
There's also a question: how do you add different flavors to it? You mentioned making an orange flavored mead.
Yes. So for different flavors, you can do a couple different things. You can actually use fruit, essentially the juice from the fruit, and you just have to replace the water with that. So like I make a cherry mead. The cherry mead is actually, you have the 15 pounds of honey, but then you also have about 3 3/4 gallons of cherry juice, because that's what I had on the hand, and I just filled up the rest with water to up to the 5 gallons. So that would go along with to make kind of a cherry mead. You can also do cherry juice and then add some cherries, actual full cherries cut up in that into the actual, like a secondary, and that could infuse some flavors as well. With oranges, you can do that, or you can add orange juice, you can add the rinds, pretty much anything you can get flavor from oranges. Same thing with gingers, just adding into that. So usually if it's not a juice, you add it in a secondary. Depending on how much sugar there is, like I've had a couple exploding tops because the yeast nutrient energizer took off too quickly, along with all the berry sugars and the honey, and that just like pretty much turned it up, and then essentially popped the top over at the middle of the night and left a nice little ring, the red ring of berry juice on the top of our ceiling, and then the lid landed like 10 feet away. Yeah, so those, I mean, experimentations. I mean, I do like an apple cider as well, but I use hand-pressed apples of the juice along with, instead of water. For some other things, I make a maple mead, which is just essentially the same straight as honey, water, yeast, except I took about I replaced a half gallon of water with a half gallon of maple syrup. So, I mean, you can do a bunch of various different things of, like, you can throw fruit in there. I mean, if you're throwing fruit into it or juicing, that's when you'll want to heat things up just to pasteurize it, to get essentially sanitized. If you use actually whole fruits, you can actually go with a frozen fruit, because that's already been flash frozen and sanitized that one, killed off everything there. So you can go from that straight into as well. I've done a beer that way. Any other questions?
Yes, question just popped up. What factors affect the alcohol content?
So factors that affect the alcohol content is just how much sugar. So like if you do a straight 15 pounds of honey and then the rest water and no additional things with the yeast, it'll probably end up being about 10% ABV. If you added like my cherry of the mead, it would be the 15 pounds of honey plus 3 gallons of cherry juice. That most likely is going to be a little bit, not on the sweet side, but I mean, it's going to be a little bit sweeter, but not too dry. And then it's probably, not for the yeast that I actually use, it has an alcohol tolerance of 17%. And that's essentially with all the cherry juice and honey, it got up to the 17%, it killed itself off.
Another question, is there a beginner's kit you can recommend?
Beginner's kit? Actually, I mean, there's nothing you can buy like kit-wise, but I mean, if you go to your local brew store or online, like Northern Brewer or something like that, if you essentially just get all you really need is a fermentation bucket, some type of airlock, so therefore the CO2 can go out and oxygen can go in during the fermentation process. And then at that point, it's just the one of the yeast things I linked. So I mean, usually with the wine yeast for a 5-gallon batch, I use the 8 gram, just because it's also a little bit over pitching it. Because usually you would probably need about 5 grams, but the smallest volume that I get off of the site that I linked in the handout is like 8 grams. So I just tend to use that as a base. And then just honey. So I mean, if you got like 15 pounds of honey from like Costco or somewhere else, yeast, water, and you just have to have a fermentation bucket and a airlock, and you can get going.
Question, you have stated it several times. Please explain what you mean by under and over pitching.
So there's an optimal amount of yeast cells to essentially get to a desired like ABV, or essentially it's like you have this much sugar. There's apps that you can do this. I mean, to do the calculation, it's like, this is what my original gravity is supposed to be. This is what I want it to be at the end of fermentation. How much yeast should I actually use? And so they would give you essentially how many yeast cells, which then you can kind of figure out based on like, okay, a packet of yeast is 2 billion. It says I need 1.5 billion. Okay, 1.5 billion. So therefore I use 3/4 of a packet, something like that. That would be just pitching. That's equal pitching. If you wanted to change the flavor profile a bit, because if the yeast is under stress because there's not enough yeast cells, it will produce a little bit slightly different things than if it had just the right amount, or if it had too much. Too much, it will speed up the process, and it might not make certain flavor profiles, but it might make others, just because of acceleration. So it's like finding out how many yeast cells is required, and then experimenting with, like, okay, well, what if I decrease it by 10% or increase it by 10%? It's just a nice thing, like kind of fun experiment to play around with, just because you can get actually different beverages, even with the same recipe, just with a different amount of yeast, or even a different yeast, the yeast strain altogether. It's just kind of going through different types of yeast strains and then just seeing what the actual flavor profiles that they provide. So like the generic one is just mainly, doesn't give much of an actual extra different flavors. It's like whatever you put in there, it's going to come out like that. Whereas the second one I use for vanillas, it actually gives a little bit of a vanilla note without actually adding vanilla, or a little bit more fruity note, because it's essentially a white wine yeast.
Other question, you mentioned mead making apps. Can you talk more about that?
Apps for kind of doing recipes and getting estimations on ABV and kind of brewing process. I mean, especially for beer, for less like boiling timers and such. I use Beersmith. So Beersmith is available on, I think it's on Android, it's on iOS, it's on Mac. And it actually has a bunch of ingredients that you can import. You can add your own ingredients. You can start adding things that will kind of give you, like for beer, it will give you like what the color of the beer is. So therefore it's like, oh, I'm trying to do this style. Well, this style should be between this and this ABV, this and this range of color, and this range of bitterness. It will give you that scale as you add ingredients. You can say it's like, oh, I'm halfway in there, so therefore let's just go that spot. Or maybe I want to tweak it a bit, add a little bit more of this. It'll be a little bit darker, but it's still within the range. It's really for like, it's also good just for like, I mean, competitions, like outside the SCA brewing competitions, they usually have these type of guidelines that they try to, it's like, oh, is it within, does it have this mouthfeel? Does it have this color? Does it this bitterness? Those type of things. But Beersmith is a really great app that I use pretty much every time I brew.
Final question, how long does it keep once you bottle it? Do you need to refrigerate it? If you open the bottle, does that affect
it? Doesn't have to be refrigerated. And about how long is probably about after start of fermentation. I usually bottle, if I follow like about the 1 to 2 months, or the about 1.5 months after for the final yeast nutrient energizer regimen, then I tend to bottle after about 3 months from fermentation. And I mean, you can bottle later on. I mean, if you're not sure that it's actually done fermenting yet, you can let it sit there. But I mean, usually after 3 months, it's usually good if you follow this regimen.
As for how long it keeps once you bottle it,
it will be drinkable at the 3 months. A year after that, it will be better than it was 3 months, but the first 3 months it's drinkable. Sometimes if you do a berry type mead, it might become a little bit, it might be too tart at the beginning or too alcoholic. Like my cherry mead was actually just, because it hit the 17%, it actually had an alcohol bite to it, and that took about a year to mellow out. And the same thing with another berry mead I did, which was too tart at the first 3 months, so it took about a year to mellow out. But other than berry ones, they're really, really drinkable at 3 months. A year later, they're even better. And it usually gets better and better till about it peaks about 8 years-ish, maybe 5 to 8 years, and then it will start downgrading. And it will just start slowly degrading as it's so about 11 to 15 years is where you want to at least have it drunk by then. But otherwise, that's pretty much all I was planning on going over. Thank you all for joining.